Welcome to another video. Tonight we have 7 stories. From tales of demons, odd happenings, virtual reality, and more. A huge thank you to all of tonight's authors for allowing me to share their stories with all of you. Remember, you can send in your own stories at reddit.com/r/slumberreads if you'd like to have one featured in a video. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also greatly appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Caleb is 10, but he still looks like the 4-year-old we adopted back in Philadelphia. When I say he hasn't aged, I don't mean he looks young for his age. I mean he hasn't aged at all. He wears the same size shoe and clothing as he did when he was 4. He's the same height and weight. He has the same childish giggle, the same porcelain doll skin. It still baffles my wife, Brienne, and me. Brienne and I picked up Caleb at the adoption agency one day in January. When we arrived, Caleb was waiting for us, bundled in his navy fishtail parka with a fuzzy brown hood that made him look like a little bear. He held a small red suitcase. "That's all you've got?" I asked, glancing at the suitcase and tussling his hair under his hood. Caleb gazed up at me with his emerald green doe eyes, his mouth downturned in a little frown. "I don't have much to bring," he said. "I only have one toy, a puppy." Brienne cooed and cawed with maternal pride, but I kept quiet. Although I admit, I had a big smile on my face that day, but the sadness in Caleb's eyes melted me in a way that's hard to describe. I'd never been one of those kid people. I wasn't keen on becoming one of those militant soccer dads who stood on the field at their kids' sports games, shaking their fists at the referees and shouting things like, "Knock 'em dead, Tiger. Show those little twerps what's up." In fact, I found overzealous family people annoying. Until we adopted Caleb, that is. After that, my whole world changed. Maybe that's what happens when people get older. The year before we adopted Caleb, I felt that paternal tug. Like someone was whispering to me that it was time to be a dad now. The first year with Caleb was fun. I taught him how to ride his bike, swim, and fish. But when Caleb turned 6, things changed. One problem was that, physically, Caleb didn't change. 2 years after we adopted him, Caleb wore the same size shoes and clothes as he did when he was 4. Brienne called the adoption agency to ask about health problems, but the agency had gone out of business a month before, and the woman who signed off on the adoption hadn't been seen or heard from since. Brienne and I worried Caleb might fall behind in other ways. "Kevin," Brienne said to me one night, "I don't want Caleb's social life to suffer. His peers look older, and he's so small." "He'll be fine," I said, brushing off the thought with a smile. "He'll grow, hun. Just wait. By this time next year, he'll be a giant." But 1 year later, we were still waiting for that growth spurt to begin. Brienne's eyes clouded with apprehension. Something has to be wrong with him. This isn't normal. In my silence, I agreed. Aside from his preternatural youth, Caleb seemed like a healthy, happy boy. He excelled in school, bringing home perfect grades. His teachers raved about his performance. Even in kindergarten, his teacher gushed about his poetic talents. I'll admit, I had doubts. I thought, how much poetic talent could a kid barely out of diapers have? But to assuage our worries, Brienne and I took Caleb to a clinic for an aptitude test. We wanted to make sure we weren't missing anything. Dr. Linda Hampton tested Caleb, then scheduled a follow-up visit with us 1 week later to review his results. When Brienne and I returned to review Caleb's test scores, Dr. Hampton shook her head, amazed. Her eyebrows arched in surprise as she reviewed his scores. My, Dr. Hampton said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. What a kid. Well, what does it say? Brienne asked, shifting in her chair. The good news is that Caleb is not lacking for intelligence, Dr. Hampton said. And? Brienne asked. Well, these results suggest that Caleb's verbal ability rivals that of a master's level college student. How old did you say he was? Dr. Hampton peered at us over her glasses. He turned 6 in February, Brienne said, frowning with worry. Oh dear, Dr. Hampton gasped. Have you considered skipping him a few grades? A few? Brienne asked, her eyebrows raising in surprise. We couldn't do that. His social development would... Dr. Hampton nodded. Well, there are schools for the gifted. Caleb might feel more comfortable with similar peers. Brienne and I exchanged glances. I agree with Brienne, I said to Dr. Hampton. We don't want to stunt his social development or have him feel awkward around the older students. Then again, I said, shifting toward Brienne, I like Dr. Hampton's suggestion about finding a school for Caleb that'll fit better. Brienne nodded. True, she said. There is Ralston's Academy. Dr. Hampton nodded with approval. Excellent choice. She said in a tone vaguely reminiscent of Faye Dunaway, circa Mommy Dearest. Ralston is top shelf in terms of its academics. I have many clients who have enrolled at Ralston. Students have to demonstrate academic performance at least 2 grades above their current level and have outstanding test scores, as your son most certainly does. A sliver of hope crept into Brienne's expression as she turned toward me. The clouds lifted from her eyes. Well, maybe. Dr. Hampton nodded again. To speak candidly, she said, Caleb's scores are off the charts. With these scores, I couldn't imagine what school would turn him down. He's sitting on a winning lottery ticket. I say you'd be wise to cash it in. That night, Brienne and I decided we would call Ralston Academy in the morning. As predicted, Ralston Academy welcomed Caleb with delirious enthusiasm. Dr. Larson, the head of admissions, said he had never seen such astronomical test scores from a student Caleb's age. When he met us, his elderly eyes beamed from behind his glasses. You have a wonderkind on your hands, he said with a pearlescent smile, then slapped me on the back. How marvelous for you both. As expected, Caleb excelled at Ralston, blowing everyone away. Even in first grade, Caleb demonstrated a gift for languages, absorbing Mandarin, French, Spanish, Greek, and Italian with dizzying ease. He hasn't taken any of these languages before, his first grade teacher said, marveling at Caleb's talents during a parent-teacher conference. Brienne and I shook our heads. He doesn't get his skills from us, I said, attempting a joke, but the teacher looked unimpressed. She flashed a wan smile, then continued. Caleb's like a sponge, she said. He started Greek classes last month, and already he has such a brilliant command of the language. His Greek teacher, who is a native by the way, says Caleb has mastered the accent to perfection. I suppressed the eye roll I could feel coming on. A little dramatic, I thought, but I had to hear this for myself. When we returned home, Caleb sat on the sofa with his babysitter, watching the History Channel. The babysitter nodded off, looking bored out of her mind, but Caleb was perched at the edge, engrossed in the program. What are you watching? I asked Caleb, whose back was turned to me. Ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, he said, sounding drunk with awe. I rolled my eyes. Really? What about a cartoon or something? Caleb spun around and shot me a sour look. Not funny, he said, then returned his attention to the television. Hey Caleb, I said. We hear you're impressing your teachers with your Greek. Why don't you say something for me? He spun back around, his eyes glowing with pride. Really? They said they're impressed? I nodded. Miss Simmons says you're doing excellent work. Then without warning, Caleb rattled off something in Greek. The authenticity of his accent sent chills through my bones. If I didn't know better, I would have thought the voice belonged to a Greek child. I would never have guessed that accent belonged to an Anglophone. My mouth dropped open. Holy shit. I started, unaware that I had vocalized my thoughts until Brienne slapped my hand. Kevin, she scolded. I covered my mouth. Caleb giggled. I'm going to record this, Caleb, I said, pulling my cell phone out of my pocket to record him. Okay, now say that again, Caleb. He repeated the phrase. Unbelievable, I said, shaking my head as I saved the recording. But before long, events took a more sinister turn. The fall after Caleb turned 6, things started happening in the neighborhood. At first, we didn't think much of it. One day we were finishing lunch when the sound of a child wailing drew our attention. We looked out the window and spotted little Todd Keller sitting on the street bawling. We rushed to the boy and moved him to the curb. His ankle was bruised and swollen. What happened? I asked, figuring he had fallen off a bike, but no bike was anywhere in sight. He clutched his ankle, wincing in pain, still crying. After he calmed, he said, Someone pushed me. Who, honey? Brienne asked. I don't know, he said, shrugging in confusion. I was just walking and someone shoved me to the ground. Todd said, drying his eyes. When I turned around, no one was there. Brienne and I traded worried glances. Here, let's get you home, I said. Brienne and I walked him to his house around the corner, and Todd's mother thanked us. All of us were confused about the incident, but as the days passed, we forgot about it. Around that time, animals started going missing. It started with the next-door neighbor's cat, then escalated. Within 2 weeks, 6 neighbors reported cats missing. One reported a missing parakeet, which I thought was random. Why would someone want that? I wondered. One afternoon, Brienne and I chatted with the neighbors while we waited for the school bus to drop off Caleb. At first I thought my cat ran away. Mrs. Jones, our next-door neighbor, said, but when 5 more cats went missing after mine did, I suspected foul play. The other women nodded in agreement. What do you mean foul play? Mr. Gross, another neighbor, asked, looking concerned. As in something dangerous? Mrs. Jones shrugged. Could be anything, she said, her voice hinting at something more ominous than she was admitting. Just saying, there could be some kind of... Never mind. But Mr. Gross pressed her for details. Go on, he urged. Some kind of what? Black magic or weird occult shit? Mrs. Jones nodded, and the other neighbors traded worried glances, looking more disturbed as each minute passed. Caleb's school bus rounded the corner, and Caleb descended moments later. We waved at the neighbors, then returned inside. What was that all about? Caleb asked as the neighbors dispersed. Just us neighbors talking, Brienne said. But Caleb wasn't satisfied. About what? Well, she said, people are worried about their pets, honey. People's cats are missing. But instead of looking worried, as we expected, Caleb broke out into a broad grin, then giggled. Concerned, Brienne shot him a dark look. Caleb, she scolded, it isn't funny. How would you like it if your pet went missing? Neither of us were prepared for his response. He whipped his head around and shot her a withering glare, his eyes narrowing. If I was dumb enough to let my cat roam the streets unattended, then I'd say I deserved what I got. The guy probably buried them in a pet cemetery down the road. Without another word, he went inside. Brienne and I traded glances, horrified. That night, Brienne went to Caleb's room to talk to him, but he wouldn't speak. Later, she told me what happened. He scowled at me, refusing to speak, she said. I joked. So are you going to give me the silent treatment forever? But he didn't crack a grin. I gave up, but when I walked away, I tripped and fell. From the ground, I glanced under his bed, and, oh my God, Kevin, there were animal leashes under there. But the next day, when we went to check it out, nothing was there. A week later, Mrs. Jones said that police had found her cat buried in a shallow grave up the street. She announced the news to the neighbors, sobbing. He was buried next to 5 other neighbors' cats in a pet cemetery a mile up the road, she said, sniffling. One night about a month later, I awoke to the sound of muffled voices coming from down the hall. Brienne was asleep next to me. Caleb was the only other person in the house, or so I thought. Who was he talking to? I wondered. I crept out of the bedroom, tiptoeing to avoid detection. I crept towards Caleb's room and pressed my ear to the door. He sounded like he was having a conversation. Caleb giggled. I wouldn't do that, he exclaimed. My eyebrows shot up as I listened. Who was he talking to? I would wait, Caleb said again, then giggled. But what came next made the hairs on my arms stand upright. The deep voice of a much older man replied, I can keep an eye on them for you. But I didn't wait to hear the rest. Without a second thought, I flung open the door. My eyes darted around the room, half expecting to catch someone crawling out the window, but no one was there. The window was undisturbed. I had opened the door in a flash before anyone would have had time to flee. Whoever was here wouldn't have had time to escape. I looked under the bed. No one. I had opened the door in the middle of that person's sentence. Whoever he was, whoever had been in Caleb's room didn't seem to be there now. Caleb, who were you just talking to? I asked, panting. Caleb giggled. My friend Daniel. Who's Daniel? And where is Daniel? Dad, Caleb said, rolling his eyes and laughing. Don't be silly. Daniel is right here. He pointed up at an empty space in front of him, at something that stood at a height about 1 inch shorter than me. My skin crawled with chills. No one was there. Since then, we have taken Caleb to several child psychologists, but nothing has come from it. They either try to put him on antidepressants or tell us to spend more time with him. Never mind that we already spend lots of time together as a family. One psychologist said spending more time with Caleb might eliminate his need for imaginary friends. But the more time goes by, the more I question how imaginary Daniel is. Daniel knows things he shouldn't know. We've tested Caleb to see if we can trick him somehow, but so far it hasn't worked. One day I told Caleb, ask Daniel where I was born. Where was my dad born? Caleb asked the empty room. Then, South Philadelphia, Caleb said without a pause. And when you were 5, your family moved to Pittsburgh, then California, then back to Philadelphia 1 year later. All correct. And Daniel knew about Brienne's tumultuous relationship with her now deceased mother. He knew about her depression as a teenager. He knew she had 2 miscarriages before we adopted Caleb. Caleb knew none of this information, so how Daniel knew was a mystery. Caleb is 10 now, but he still talks to Daniel every day. It looks like Daniel is here to stay. A few nights ago, Brienne and I were reminiscing about when we adopted Caleb. Then I remembered that voice recording I had saved of him speaking Greek back in 1st grade. Did we ever figure out what it was he was saying? Brienne asked. I shook my head. No, but you know what? One of my colleagues has a Greek mother-in-law. I'll send him the recording and see if he'll have her translate it. I had kept that recording in my phone, so I pulled it up and texted it to my colleague. He texted back within the hour. He wrote, "I sent it to her, and she listened to it. This is what it says. Don't you know who I am? When will you realize who I am?" Life isn't always as we know it. We humans aren't the only ones in this vast universe. Other beings reside among us as well. Sometimes we see them, sometimes we don't. Have you ever saw a shadow by your window, only to open it and find nothing outside? Maybe you heard a knock on your door at night, but opening the door you see nothing outside. Maybe you heard your bed creak loudly, just to look and find your lazy dog still sleeping on the floor. Maybe you felt a tail brushing past your leg from under the sofa. First, you'd think it was your cat, then realize you don't have one and look under the sofa to find nothing. Nothing is a mean word. There's always something. I live in a town that you could almost call a village if it weren't for a few shopping malls and a multiplex. I can't tell you the name of this town or my name either, for the sake of your own life. The only thing I can tell you are these events. First, I couldn't risk telling these events, but now it's pushing me over the edge. So let's begin, shall we? The rain, when it falls, looks like stars, falling on the ground to reflect the night itself, like creation itself, sprinkling these dazzling stars just as a finishing touch to its masterpiece. I loved the rain. Now I hate it, even more than I did a few months ago. The rain brings things in my house. Some are neutral, some are aggressive. It all started when I bought this house, moved out of my childhood town, the town in which 24 years of my life was spent. Moved here, bought the only house available for sale. Big mistake. I was in the living room when it all first happened. A knock came on the front door. It was raining heavily. Almost could be mistaken for a storm. I got to the door thinking it was the plumber I had been requesting to fix my broken sink pipeline for 3 days. I opened the door. I screamed as I opened the door. I fell on my back and began tumbling my way backwards towards the bedroom, kicked the door shut and barricaded the door, then leaned against the wall, started sliding down until I hit the floor. Now I was sitting on the floor with my back pressed against the wall, both my arms wrapped around my knees. I began thinking about what I saw. A tall, lanky man, tall at an unnatural height, almost 11 feet tall, entering through the door by ducking. He was gray-colored, his face was absent of any features, and he was wet. After a few hours, which felt like days, I heard the front door open and shut. I silently moved the barricade and risked a peek. For those who are thinking why I didn't call someone, my phone was left on my couch. Idiot? I am. No one in the living room. I silently snuck to the kitchen, picked a knife and started searching the house. After triple checking all rooms, making sure no one was in the house, I was convinced I hallucinated. That wasn't until I saw muddy footprints all over the floor. It started from the front door, went to all rooms one by one before going back to the front door and vanishing. By saying vanishing, I mean no footprints could be found outside, like it vanished after getting out of the front door. I started panicking and ran all over the house. After a few minutes, stopped my mad sprint and calmed myself. Or maybe got exhausted. Or maybe the pain of occasionally getting hit on the head. Whatever the reason, I cleaned the footprints. After the cleaning, I thought of what it all was. when my thoughts shot back to a bunch of cardboard boxes left by the previous owner in the basement. Maybe he left them on purpose. Maybe he knew what he was dealing with. Maybe he left a clue in there, so the next person would know what he is dealing with. So I went to the basement as I hadn't cleared the boxes from the basement. I know, okay? I am a lazy guy. After hours of rummaging through the boxes, I found them empty. Shocked, I started tossing the boxes over the room when I found a piece of paper nailed in the wall behind the boxes. It had something written on it. After reading it, I realized it wasn't any paper but a torn page of a journal. I gently tore it from the nail and tucked it in my pocket. It was written about how this house was built upon a bridgeway to other realms, about how things come and take shelter when it rains. Not commonly, rarely so. I came to know the two types of these things, neutral and aggressive. To clear your confusion, the tall thing was neutral. I have encountered them 28 times now. By now, I mean a whole year. Told you they come rarely. Of 28 things, only 7 were aggressives. The reason I am telling you these to you all is because of my most recent encounter. I almost grew accustomed to it. Neutrals weren't a problem. The only problem I had were the muddy footprints. Well, the aggressives left footprints too. They basically stalked the house until the rain stopped, but the aggressives weren't so nice. I was alert when it was an aggressive. Aggressives, in the best case, broke some plates, and in the worst case, threw me against the wall. They don't kill you, if that makes you feel any better. My recent encounter was 2 days ago. I was watching weather forecasts, as it was raining for 1 day and 13 hours straight when a knock came on the front door. Bracing myself for any aggressives, I opened the door but was met with brown eyes and black hair, a face that had all the human features. The face felt familiar. Searching my brain for the face, remembering it's a friend from high school. He was smiling. I smiled, told him to come in, then after exchanging formalities, asked him if he would like some coffee. He agreed. Walking my way to the kitchen, I felt relieved as I didn't have a human guest over in a year. While making coffee, I was thinking hard about my memories with him, when the memories came gushing like water. It was a sunny day. We used to play with other kids from the neighborhood in an open field with a river not far from us, the river which my parents warned not to come close to. He had brought a new football. We were playing it with it when I unintentionally kicked it hard to the direction of the river, causing it to land across the river. We all thought for a moment before abandoning the idea of swimming across it. The current was too strong for us to swim through. "I'll do it," he said. He was always the adventurous type. We clearly denied the opinion, but he wouldn't listen. He went after that stupid football, not listening to the requests of 8 kids almost his age. He strugglingly made it to the opposite side, picked the ball, and clutching it to his chest, started swimming back towards us. We told him to throw the ball towards us, but he didn't. Doesn't always mean all adventurous persons are smart. Halfway through the river, his ball slipped and he lost focus for 1 second. That was enough time for the current to break his posture and start dragging him away. He screamed for help, but before we could do anything, we heard a sickening crack. He had hit his head on a rock. We could only watch helplessly as our muscle denied to move. The last thing we saw was the ball. They never found his body. I was snapped back to reality by the sound of the mug breaking by falling from my hand. I shot a glance behind me, finding him grinning at me by the kitchen door. I looked behind his shoulder. Muddy footprints. Shit. He had blocked my only exit. After my first few encounters with the aggressives, I knew better than to use knives against them, and this one was even different. So I used the only advantage of humanity over these things. wits. With all my strength, I hurled myself towards him, and he did what I had expected. He dodged me and stood aside. Though I hadn't planned on building so much momentum, which I certainly did, so I couldn't stop myself, and was now hurling at my own wall of the living room. As I slammed into the concrete wall head first, dizziness took over me. Trying to suppress the dizziness, I tried to stand up and fell. Realizing I couldn't stand, I started to crawl my way towards the bedroom. I couldn't move an inch before something was holding my leg. I glanced backwards to see him holding my right leg, glaring at me. With all the strength I had, if I had any, I kicked on his face. Hard, and to my surprise and shock, he stumbled and fell backwards. Without wasting a second, I made a mad dash for the bedroom. Or maybe a mad crawl. I still don't know what I did as adrenaline took over me. Just as I reached the bedroom, I swung back to close the door to see him running at me in an inhuman speed. In a swift motion, I swung the door shut and felt relieved for a second. Until the door blew up. Is it only me, or doesn't my relief last more than a second? I was launched from the ground and crashed into the wall above my bed again. I groaned as I fell on the bed and tried to sit up. Suddenly, I was slowly levitating above the bed until I was mid-air, floating above my bed in a standing position. The dizziness was in its final stage. Soon, I will be unconscious. I realized he was screaming something. I weakly opened my eyes to see him standing in front of the bed, glaring at me. I couldn't make out what he was saying. He was sounding like someone talking underwater. Either my ear was ringing or he sounded like that. I don't know. Finally, I could make out the words. You killed me. He then positioned his hands in front of him, positioning his hands like he was pressing someone's neck, and at the same time I felt hands from both sides of my neck. The invisible hands started getting tighter and tighter. Now I was gasping for breath, kicking the air, and as both hands were trying to find the hands around my neck, tears started rolling down my eyes and a small stream of blood was pouring out of the portion where I hit my head on the wall earlier. Now he was repeatedly screaming, "You killed me! You killed me!" Right after, his skin started to decay until his skin was black, barely clinging on his bones, as his head revealed a smashed skull. No, was the only thing I could choke out before my vision started tunneling. When I was almost losing consciousness, the pressure was released. I dropped on my bed. After a few moments of gasping and heavy breaths, I came back to my senses and realized the rain has stopped. After minutes of groaning and rolling, I came to know I had a dislocated left shoulder, a seriously bruised neck, and a cracked skull. After limping my way to the living room, a chill ran down my spine. My bedroom door was broken to bits and a crack formed on the wall where I hurled into. But none of them were the source of the chill. In the middle of my living room, on the center of the suddenly wet floor lay a bloodied football. The sun had set beneath the horizon, casting the forest in a sad, gray light. Moss hung down from the trees, kissing the dirty brown water. Insects chirped through the trees while frogs croaked in a clamor. The breeze smelled fresh and muddy. We were walking back to our campsite. Me and 6 other friends of mine from college. We were camping out in the Louisiana woodlands for spring break in a place that couldn't seem to decide if it was a forest or a bayou. A few of them had flashlights towards the front while I walked in the back. I'm not usually one to feel scared out in the woods. I grew up out in the woods, but for some reason I just felt off. I looked at the dirty pond we were walking past. Bits of trash and driftwood floated atop it, while reeds swayed back and forth from beneath the surface, illuminated only by pale moonlight. My vision hung there for a while, I felt uneasy, but I couldn't place why. I thought I saw movement on the other side of the pond, but it was gone when I blinked. I looked away. No sooner than that, I heard a splash. I jolted my head back to see what happened, but I saw nothing. Nothing at all. Only the swaying of the trees. That was around when I realized that Danny was gone. He had been walking behind me. I hadn't been thinking about him. I stopped in my tracks and looked back, searching the darkness. My other friends didn't stop. "Danny, where you at?" I called. There was nothing. "Danny, quit fucking around." No response. I squinted my eyes, peering into the dark trees and the bend of the trail. I only heard the chatter of my friends further ahead. As I peered, I began to see movement. Then it stopped. Then there was a spasm of movement. Then it stopped. My heart began to beat faster. Then I saw a figure of who I assumed was Danny rise up from the ground. But then it spoke. "I'm coming," said a horrid, raspy voice. It sounded like gravel. "What the fuck?" I said. There was a cacophony of hoarse coughs and wheezes. Then the voice that spoke was Danny's. "Sorry, I tripped. I'm coming," said Danny. He ran forward and stopped next to me. I could see that it was Danny. That fluffy brown hair, rounded face, and skinny frame. Danny. "Are you okay, dude? You seem tense," said Danny. He had a look of genuine concern. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said. "Let's catch up with the others." "Good idea," he said. With that, we ran up the trail. I pushed away the fearful thoughts from my head. We arrived back at the campsite a few minutes later. The 4 others who remained behind had already started cracking open some beers. The fire was dancing red and hot. One of them voiced his excitement at our return. And so, the drinking commenced. I cracked one open and sat on a folding chair near the flames. Danny sat across from me on a bag of wood. He wasn't drinking. That was odd. Danny was usually the first one to start. I pushed it out of my mind. I was being paranoid. We all laughed and drank and laughed some more. Lucy was already drunk, as usual. Joseph was now pouring whiskey shots. Danny spoke calmly with the others. Danny hadn't laughed at all. Not even once. I saw him chuckle occasionally, but it always seemed forced. And he still hadn't had a drink. "Why don't you crack open a cold one, Danny?" I asked. "Nah, not really feeling it. Maybe in a bit," he said. A few more minutes passed. That was around when Danny turned to Joseph. "Hey bro, follow me. I gotta show you something in my car," said Danny. "What is it?" asked Joseph. "You left something in my trunk. Or at least I think it's yours. I just remembered it right now," said Danny. "Alright," said Joseph. The two stood up and walked into the darkness towards the cars. I watched them go while the others didn't seem to notice. I felt uneasy again. Oddly, even more uneasy than I felt in the forest. "You're being stupid," I thought. I saw movement coming from the darkness. As it got closer, I saw that it was Danny and Joseph. Perfectly fine. They walked up to the fire and sat down. "Did you find what you were looking for?" I asked. "What?" asked Joseph, confused. "Oh, yeah, right. It was mine. It was somebody else's jacket." Suddenly, Joseph was seized by a violent fit of coughs. He hacked and wheezed for a solid minute. "Joseph, you good?" I asked. He hacked once more and spit on the ground. Everyone was looking at him with an expression of concern, except Danny. "Yeah, I'm fine," said Danny. He wasn't asking about you, said Mary. Oh, my... He stuttered a bit more. I thought I heard my name. I'm fine, said Joseph. I looked at them both for a long while. The uneasiness had transfigured into dread. You're being paranoid, I thought. But it didn't matter what I thought. Something deep within me was telling me that something was wrong. Something was off. We all went back to drinking and talking. I had stopped doing both. I just stared into the fire and glanced at both Danny and Joseph. They weren't talking much either. Hey, Colin, said Danny to me. I just remembered. I saw a pretty big pile of sticks out in the woods. Pretty good size, too. Mind coming with me to get them? Everything in me was telling me no, that I shouldn't go with him. I think we've got enough here, wouldn't you say? I said, barely masking the nervousness. Can never have too much firewood, said Joseph. I'll come, said Mary. Me too, slurred a drunken Lucy. A look of disappointment seemed to pass over Danny's face, but he nodded and stood up, followed by Joseph and the girls. I watched them recede off into the woods, becoming dark outlines. I felt like I should run, that I should get out of there. What the fuck is wrong with you? Just stop it. Calm the fuck down, I thought to myself. But I couldn't calm down. Something was wrong. Something was definitely wrong. 15 minutes passed. 15 minutes I spent nervously staring into the forest. Corey, the guy sitting next to me, asked if I was okay. I reassured him I was fine and went back to freaking out in my head. Then they returned. They lazily wandered forward, carrying a measly number of sticks which they threw down on the ground. Lucy and Mary appeared like their regular old selves. Lucy still drunk as shit. They sat down by the fire again without saying anything to anyone. That wasn't a lot of wood, said Corey. Yeah, I couldn't find the spot. Hard to see at night, said Danny. I actually dropped a few on the way back over here. One of them was a big log. You mind coming with me? My flashlight's dead, so I'd like to use yours. Yeah, sure, said Corey. With that, he followed Danny into the woods. After they left, Lucy stood up and stumbled off away from the fire, drunkenly whooping and laughing. What the fuck, Lucy? Come back, yelled Joseph. Would some of y'all come with me to go get her? It would ruin our nights if her drunk ass got lost. Several others nodded in assent. They got up and ran after her, leaving me and one other, Hannah, who continued staring into the fire. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. I've got to get out of here, I thought. The rational part of my brain was trying to get me to calm down, but something deep and primal was telling me that something really bad was happening. Hannah had a look of fear in her eyes. She looked into the fire, seemingly lost in thought. I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. You freaked out too? I asked. She looked up, surprised. No. Why you ask? I took a deep breath. Don't lie to me. Something weird is going on. I know you feel it too. Hannah averted her eyes, thinking for a moment. It's nothing. Just enjoy the fire, she said. But I couldn't enjoy the fire. Something was wrong. I just couldn't escape that feeling. So, I got up and walked to my car. Are you leaving? Asked Hannah, concerned. No, I'm just going to go get something, I said. I couldn't quite bring myself to leave. I had nothing solid to go off. I didn't want to drive off only to find out that nothing had been wrong. Instead, I walked to my car and grabbed my knife from the middle compartment. Then I walked back to my chair and sat down, shaking my leg up and down with nervous anticipation. That was about when all of them returned. They came back around the exact same time, Danny and Corey emerging from the forest. Danny smiled at me, a smile that seemed malicious. Me and Corey couldn't find the log. Did y'all find Lucy? He asked. How did you know Lucy was gone? I asked. Danny whipped his head back at me angrily. So did Corey. I heard them calling her name, said Danny. I didn't hear that, I said. Well, you must have bad hearing then. Didn't you hear them calling for her, Hannah? He asked questioningly. I may have, said Hannah. See, Colin, you have bad hearing, said Danny. Everyone else started to clamber back into their chairs and seating spots. No one even made mention of the search for Lucy. Lucy seemed completely sober now. I eyed them all like a scared animal. My body was in flight or fight mode. I knew something bad was about to happen. There were a few moments of tense silence, like a rubber band about to snap. Then, in an explosion of movement, Danny and Corey grabbed Hannah in one synchronous action. Her mouth was covered just after she belted a surprised yelp. Just as this happened, I dove out of the way of Mary trying to grab me. I jumped up and ran into the forest. I'd like to say that I tried to help Hannah, but there was nothing I would have been able to do. There were too many of them. All I heard behind me was the shuffling of arms and legs as they did God knows what to her. Then I heard the patter of footfalls as they chased after me. Help! Someone help me! I yelled into the forest. No one came. I ran through the trees and the underbrush as branches and weeds slapped against my face, leaving long bloody gashes down my cheeks and arms. I didn't stop though. I knew I couldn't stop. They were gaining on me. All of them were chasing me. A whole stampede of feet tramping through the vegetation. I tried to run faster, but my body was aching. The adrenaline was the only thing that pushed me forward. My foot got snagged on a tree stump. I twisted and stumbled into muddy water. I had found a portion of the bayou. It stank of foul rot. I tried moving forward, but I heard them not far behind me. So, I sank deeper into the water. There they were. I could see their dark shapes hovering on the edge of the water, evil forms imposing on the night. I felt myself submerged, desperate not to move an inch. They fanned out on both sides of the bayou, trying to figure out which way I had gone. I was running out of air. I willed myself to remain conscious, but it didn't matter. My vision grew fuzzy and dark. I needed air. I pushed my head above water for a brief moment. That was all they needed. There he is, yelled Lucy. Not a moment later, multiple hands grabbed me and yanked me out of the bayou. I kicked and screamed, but soon their hands were over my mouth. They slammed me against the muddy earth, laughing with glee as the wind was knocked out of me. Nowhere to go now, said Danny in a voice that was not Danny's. It was a rough voice, callous and cold. 4 of them had me pinned to the ground as Danny casually strolled towards me, looking down on with an expression of malicious joy. I was covered in foul water and slimy mud, strong hands holding me in place. I struggled and screamed, but it was useless. They overpowered me. I was absolutely petrified. Danny stood above me, and that was when I saw his eyes were pure black. Corey grabbed my face and held my mouth open. I began trying to reach for my knife. A thick, black liquid began to ooze out of Danny's mouth. It inked its way down his face and into my hand, coalescing into one stinking glob. He began to bring it down to my open mouth. Another body, he said. With all the strength I had left, I jerked my hand into my pocket. I grabbed my knife and then thrust it into Danny's side. Every single one of them screamed a scream I had never heard. It sounded like the screeching of a braking car, but magnified, twisted, and prolonged. The voice that erupted from them seemed to be one. The hands that held me in place loosened long enough for me to break away. I jumped up and ran back in the direction of the campsites where I knew my car was waiting. It didn't take long for them to recuperate. They were chasing me yet again. My face was lashed by branches as I ran through the trees, but I didn't stop. Despite my exhaustion, I willed myself to keep running. I could see our dying fire through the trees. I broke out into the clearing of our campsite and ran towards our parked cars. I unlocked my sedan and jumped in. They were on me in a moment, pounding their fists on the windows. Corey was carrying a rock. He threw it at my windshield, shattering the glass and bloodying my face in a rain of knives. I put the car in reverse and ran over whoever was behind me. I didn't even see. I then clicked on my headlights and drove back down the dirt road at the highest speed I could manage. Soon, they were out of sight and I was driving down the highway fast enough to get pulled over. After a few miles, after I was sure I was a safe distance away, I pulled over on the side of the road. There, I broke down into tears and yelling. I cursed at myself, my friends, and whatever the hell was that did that to them. After I had let it all out, I put the car back in drive and drove to a hospital. I spent that night in the hospital. My parents met me there a few hours later. The doctors managed to bring me back to health, although I still have scars across my face from the glass. The police questioned me about what happened and I told them everything, despite their incredulous looks. I didn't mention the black fluids and the change in their voices and eyes because there was absolutely no way they would believe me. They already weren't entirely buying the story I told them. None of them have been seen since. Police and rescue services scoured the park and were unable to find any sign of them. I miss my friends. Not a day goes by that I don't think about what happened in those woods, that I don't think of whatever entity it was that stole them from me. I'm terrified of pools, and for good reason. Nothing happened to me in particular, but people around me is a different story. I'll just start at the first death and work forward from there. There was a community pool not 3 streets down from my parents' old house. I remember it as a sort of suburban oasis where, on most summer days, you'd find the entirety of the neighborhood splashing or sunning or swimming. You could buy corn dogs for $1 a piece and a fistful of red vines for $1 more. And there was a high dive with a perpetual queue of nervous kids and showboating teens. The high dive is what made the pool special. Exciting, really. A place for kids to experience that momentary exhilaration that they couldn't find among the lap-swimming adults of the Holiday Inn or the YMCA. I had decided in the summer I turned 9 that I would finally join the excitement. "You gonna jump this time, Rusty?" My friend, Carrie, asked over her shoulder as we waited behind a group of cannonballers and jackknifers. I had worked up the courage the summer before to climb the 12-foot ladder, but chickened out as I stood looking over the edge. The climb back down the ladder had been difficult. The walk back to my mom's towel-laden chairs had been worse. Not this year. I was ready. "Yeah, Carrie. Just watch from the side and try not to drown in my tidal wave." She giggled as the last of the teens made their ascent. I remember she had smirked down at me halfway through her climb. "Remember, Rusty, be brave and keep walking until you're in the water. Close your eyes if you have to. It's really fun after you get the jitters out." I craned my neck around the ladder tower to watch her, high up, silhouetted by lazy sunlight, gently bobbing on the end of the board. She curled her toes over the edge of the board, then with one bounce, arched into a graceful dive. I heard a kid scream and a lifeguard's whistle trill before my mind registered what I had seen. She hit the surface of the water and her body just stopped, crumpling as though she dove into dry concrete. Her face split as her head followed her outstretched arms and her body curled over. My friend, Carrie, a bloody tangle of limbs, just lay on the surface for a moment before sinking beneath. The pool was closed for years after that, drained and covered. Concession stand shuttered and locked. Chain link fence overgrown with honeysuckle and rust. They had looked into Carrie's death and talked to me and the other kids, but no one could explain what had happened. She must have belly flopped. My mom told me as I cried, my young brain attempting to process the trauma. I told her again and again what I had seen, but she thought the same thing. Honey, that's impossible. I think your mind is playing tricks on you. The thing was, all of the kids and the 20-something lifeguards had the same story at first. She just stopped. The rationalizations of all the adults were just changed the uniformity of uncertainty. She must have hit her head on the diving board. She must have dove too deep, too quickly, and struck the bottom. You were all in shock when you saw the blood. Your minds were playing tricks on you. When my dad, Rusty Sr., was dying of cancer years later, he told me lots of stories about his childhood. He talked about riding bikes and stealing Playboys from one father or another. He talked about life in the town nearby, the shops, the people, the baseball games, and the streets. And he talked about the time he had pushed Laura Singer off of the high dive at the community pool. Our community pool. I was 7, maybe 8. She was a little older, and man, I had a crush on her. She had pretty brown hair like your mom's and those beautiful green eyes. I don't know why I pushed her. Probably that same reason that little boys pull pigtails. It was stupid in hindsight, but it didn't seem like anything at the time. Still, she landed wrong. The lifeguards were kids too, more or less, and by the time she floated to the surface, it was too late. Wait, so you killed her, Dad? What happened? He stared in silence for a while before he answered. I was young and they didn't blame me. Not really. Your grandpa laid into me for it, but that wasn't unusual. He had to talk to the girl's family, smooth things over. Ultimately, everybody decided it was an accident. I hadn't tried to kill her, you see. But Laura managed to punish me in her own way. Guilt has a way of making someone think that bad things happening have a reason behind them. My dad passed away a week later. I didn't feel guilty about Carrie, but I felt sad, conflicted. Despite the explanations and, in my teenage years, the therapy, I always remembered what I saw. When I was 17, I decided to talk to my mom about everything, thinking perhaps the passage of time would lend credibility to my recollection. Hey Mom, you were always the one to take me to the pool when I was younger. Why didn't Dad ever come? My mother looked off pensively. He told me about Laura Singer, Mom. She looked up at me, a mixture of surprise and concern across her face. It wasn't just her, Rusty. I mean, that was a horrible thing your father went through for being so young, and horrible for her family, I'm sure, but they didn't come close down the pool like they did with Carrie. Your father went back the following summer. His cousins were visiting from Illinois. You mean Uncle Mark and Uncle Jameson? And his cousin Sarah. I had never heard of a cousin Sarah. My dad never mentioned her. My mom sighed and continued. The way your dad told it, the diving board was being repaired early on that summer, so he and his cousins had taken to throwing pennies into the diving well and trying to collect as many as they could on a single breath. Your dad had gone, and then Mark and then Sarah took her turn. They watched her get 3 coins off of the bottom, But as she came up, she couldn't seem to breach the surface. Your dad and Jameson jumped in while Mark pulled her arm from the edge of the pool, but she was just stuck. Your dad said he watched Sarah drown while trying to help her out of the pool. Now, I never quite believed his telling of things, but after your story about Carrie, a small part of me wasn't quite sure anymore. I digested the story for a bit as the two of us sat wordlessly together. I know what I saw that day, Mom. Carrie didn't hit her head on that diving board. She nodded in a gesture of quiet understanding but didn't speak again about it. I tried not to think about it. My dad had killed a girl when he was a kid. He had watched his cousin drown. I had watched my friend dive into a messy death. It was a lot, but it was the past. The pool was drained and rumor had it that the county planned to turn it into a community garden. A year later, I was home from my first year of college. My girlfriend had tagged along for a week before her family was supposed to pick her up and drive up to Canada for vacation. I had argued against going to the pool, but she had a morbid curiosity about the whole thing, and I figured we might fool around when she got bored with the tragedy of it all. So you've never actually ever been in the diving well then? I thought about it. No, I guess not. Carrie's death kind of got in the way. She dragged on a joint and passed it to me. I tapped the ash past my dangling legs into the dark void below. Why do you think it happened, Rusty? Could she have been, I don't know, diving too fast? I've heard that jumping off of a bridge into water can sometimes be like hitting concrete. Something about surface tension. Not a very high bridge, though, you know? I coughed out, looking up at the mildewing tower with its sun-damaged board leaning against it. It was a ghostly thing at night. Its once sky-blue paint, now pocked and bleached. The pool cover had been similarly neglected. The fabric had ripped at the corner of the diving well, leaving behind a yawning darkness into which we hung our legs. Well, I think it's high time you took a dip. She smiled slyly and grabbed the joint from my fingers. Even if I had an interest, the water's all... She slipped over the edge and into the darkness. Carmen? Carmen, I can still see the cherry from the joint. She drew a long breath, illuminating her grinning face in an orange glow, and then ducked out of sight beneath the pool cover. Oh, gross. Maybe this was a bad idea. There's so much sludge down... Ah, fuck. I heard a splash below. You okay? Yeah, I just stepped in a puddle or something. Hang on. The darkness retreated instantly as I heard the gritty shrieks of a lighter wheel. I patted my pocket. Carmen always had a knack for pilfering lighters. I saw the mounds of leafy detritus she must have stepped in, but Carmen was still out of view. I looked around for a saner way down than dropping the 12 feet to the bottom and sliding along the filthy, sloping edge of the well, but I didn't see one. Carmen? Rusty, it was a drain, but you've got to see this. The water kind of looks like... Carmen yelped, and I heard another splash as the diving well went into blackness once more. Carmen? No answer but the sound of erratic movements and wet slaps. Carmen? And gurgling. I slid down the side into the darkness after her. I could hear better from the bottom, but couldn't see a thing. I followed the faint gurgles, patting my hands along the slimy concrete enamel, when my hand touched flesh. I grabbed onto Carmen and pulled, but her head was stuck. I couldn't see. I needed to see, but the sheltered darkness offered no reprieve. Her slapping became less emphatic, the gurgling more labored. I pulled, and finally her head came free. She wasn't breathing. She had no pulse. I sat in the darkness and held her limp body in my arms. Then I remembered I wasn't alone. I frantically searched the bottom of the diving well, hoping that my eyes both would and wouldn't adjust to the dark. When I found the lighter, my hand shook so much that I had to strike it a half dozen times before it lit, each hiccup of sparks illuminating her lifeless body. I saw the open drain in the flickering light, reflecting dancing ribbons, its black watery surface. Did she drown in that? It seemed improbable, and yet it was the best explanation I could conjure. I searched for whatever had done it, whatever had held her down as I tried to pull her free. Nothing. Just the catacombic stillness of the empty pool where now 2 of my friends had died. I let the flames go as the heat began to burn my finger. Why was this happening? How? I listened but heard only silence. Finally, I knew I had to try and leave. Carmen had looked into the water. I would stay away. I wiped tears from my eyes and tried the lighter again. Shick, shick, shick. I dropped the lighter as soon as it lit. The flame illuminated a face right next to mine. Pale, greasy, bloated skin with dark, wet hair and muddy green eyes. I felt the grip of an icy hand around my wrist, biting into what little fortitude I still had left. I screamed into the echoing vault before me, but realized just as quickly as the shock had come that I was alone again. Me and Carmen and the empty darkness of the well. After college, I moved away to the Pacific Northwest. I had told my mom about Carmen's death, and she gave me the same understanding nod as she had when I had talked to her about Carrie. Carmen's parents were devastated, but in time, they accepted that her death had been a freak accident. For years, I stayed away from pools. I lied and told my friends that I couldn't swim, that I didn't care to learn. I didn't speak of Carrie or Carmen or the stories my dad told me before his death. The stories seemed so unbelievable, like my mind had been playing tricks on me. They filled the community pool with gravel and topsoil, and I tried to bury my memories along with its diving well. When I got married, my wife and I went to the Caribbean for our honeymoon. She found it charming that a man who hadn't known how to swim as an adult would later learn and insist on swimming only in natural bodies of water. I impressed my aversion onto my son, Peter, as he grew older. Pools were petri dishes, unnecessary uses of water, extravagances for the wealthy, anything to keep him safe. He married a lovely girl named Rachel 5 years ago, and 2 years later their daughter, Ivy, was born. I visited with Peter and Rachel for a week to help with my granddaughter. One night, Peter and I drank a bit too much, and I told him the story of Carrie and Carmen. He side-eyed me as I expounded on the details. I could see he was incredulous, so I didn't insist on the truth of my account, and he didn't challenge it afterward. I was relieved to tell him, honestly. He had grown into a man without suffering the losses I had. My losses seemed inconsequential when stacked against the bounty that his happy life afforded. His wife knew my favorite bourbon and called me Pops, just like my son. His little girl giggled endlessly as I bounced her on my knee playing peekaboo. And then a year ago, I got a call from my son at night. I could hear the tears in his voice. Pops, it's Rachel. She was taking a bath and I found her. She's... Oh my God, Peter. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. God, I had no idea. Ivy didn't see, did she? No, Ivy didn't see her, but she's confused and I don't know what to tell her. Jesus, Pete. Rachel always seems so happy. Why don't you two stay here, Peter? As long as you need. And don't worry about cleaning up. I'll come by and take care of that. Cleaning up? I assumed there'd be blood. You shouldn't be the one to... Pops, Rachel didn't slit her wrists. She... drowned. The memories came back in a flash. Carrie, Carmen. My wife and I always took showers. It wasn't by design. We just weren't bath people. The coroner's report came back negative for drugs. Her BAC was 0.01. The results of the single glass of Merlot sitting next to the bath. The police questioned my son, but just as with Carmen, there were no signs of force. I thought of the icy grip and the green eyes for months. I thought of Rachel, of Carmen, Carrie, and Sarah. And I thought of Laura Singer, the girl my dad had pushed off the diving board all those years ago. He had said, Laura managed to punish me in her own way. Guilt has a way of making someone think that bad happenings have a reason behind them. My father's family seemed plagued with bad happenings, all confined to the still waters of constructed leisure. Those waters had somehow clung to me. I didn't talk to my son about Laura and the others. The whole ghastly trajectory seemed deranged. But I should have. This morning I drove back from a 3-day camping trip in the backwoods. My phone got service half an hour into my drive. 6 missed calls from Peter and a dozen text messages, all from the past hour. I stopped to check the messages at a gas station. The first was a photo of Ivy smiling broadly into the camera. The second said, "First day of swim lessons." There was a high dive in the background of the photo. Sky blue, just like the one at our old community pool. I haven't read the other messages. I can't. But I know exactly what they say. I always wondered why ghost hunters never went to Chernobyl. I've seen movies where they have monsters or mutated animals there, but I have never seen anything on ghosts. You'd think with the nuclear meltdown and the amount of deaths that happened there, they would have some activity going on. It piqued my interest so much that I planned a trip over there. I've been on small ghost hunts all over the country before, so I was no stranger to this stuff. I've been to the supposed most haunted places, but never really found anything interesting. Yeah, I have seen some weird stuff on my journeys, but never anything like what I came across in Chernobyl. The ghosts are completely different there. I'm not sure if it's the radiation before their death or after their death that completely mutated them. For the trip I had to make sure I went alone. That was my thing. I noticed you get more paranormal activity when you go alone. Maybe they feel more powerful over one person than over a group of people. But by choosing to go alone, it made the trip extremely difficult and much more dangerous. After months of planning and studying the land, I was finally there. I drove as far as I could and walked a few hours to get there. I arrived early on in the day, hoping to hit all the landmarks. The Ferris wheel, the Azure swimming pool, and the iconic rows of abandoned apartment buildings reclaimed by nature. When I finally arrived there, I immediately started setting up my gear. I set up my camera and started live streaming the event online. I had a few diehard fans that watched me live. I mostly did the live stream as a type of insurance. If anything bad happened, I was hoping someone watching would call for help or alert the police. The first few hours were uneventful. I didn't hear or see anything. My supposed voice box was not picking up anything. I was honestly about to start packing up my gear when I noticed a comment on my live stream. "Who is that following you? Is that a cameraman?" Following me? Nobody's following me. I assured them. I came here alone. It's just me. I panned around and retraced my steps, but nothing was there. I thought for sure someone was trolling me, but more comments kept popping up from different people. "Who is that behind you?" they asked. This made chills run down my spine, but I had to keep my composure. This could be a local, or worse, someone looking to rob me. I did have a few $1,000s worth of gear on me. Being all alone in an abandoned city made me a very vulnerable target. If anything went wrong, I was fucked. But I had to find out who was following me. Okay, let's see how close we can get to it. I remembered entering a room with a mirror immediately adjacent to the door. Maybe I could catch a glimpse of whoever was following me using that. I circled around and made my way towards that door. When I had left, the door was open. Upon my return, it was closed and locked shut. Fuck. This is going to take some time, I told my viewers. I left my camera facing the door and tried to force it open, but it felt like this door was nailed shut when I had just been through here. I decided to give it all my strength and 3 pushes, then give up. I should probably be heading back soon anyway. 1, 2, 3. And bang, it flew open. I landed a few feet in front of the mirror, laughing, brushing the dust off myself when I realized why I'm here in the first place. The follower. I looked up into the mirror and seen a pitch black mass floating behind me. I should have ran, but I was completely frozen in fear. This didn't seem like a ghost, but like a black hole had appeared behind me. Suddenly the mass reached out towards me. Before I could flinch or even close my eyes in fear, everything went black. I don't know how long I was passed out for, but when I woke up, I was in a completely different place. Everything felt different. The air was warm with a slight noticeable draft blowing in one direction. I stood up and noticed the room was now covered in an inch of dust. The room also looked different, like someone had moved everything around, searching for something. I went to grab my camera and noticed it was gone. I reached for my backpack and that too was gone. Great. Someone fucking robbed me. I let out in anger. I was trying to piece back what happened, but I could only recall a black mass, not a person. Sadly, my head was throbbing with a headache. I could not recall anything clearly at the moment. I started to make my way out of the building when, in horror, I noticed the sky was now dark red and orange. The first thing that came to mind was the reactor somehow exploded again. I could faintly hear a siren going off in the distance, but it sounded odd. It was broken and not repeating properly like it had been running for years. I started making my way towards the exit and my rental car, which I could not be any further from. I had to make my way through the whole town and pass who knows what with all this hell going on. If this was another nuclear meltdown, I was fucked. I was right in the exclusion zone with no protective gear, nothing to defend myself with, and I still had a long way to go. As I got closer to the town center, I started hearing the strangest animal noises I have ever heard. I thought for sure the radiation was slowly torturing whatever animals were left to death. I kept walking and I noticed the whole town looked different now. I don't know what happened when I was passed out, but everything was different. It was like people were still here ravaging through everything. It was so different, I decided I should just retrace my steps so I wouldn't get lost in all this new junk. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Maybe that same follower from before. I entered into a hospital I had walked through earlier. In here, those ungodly noises were not as loud and terrifying. I swear something or someone is out there in agony right now. I did not want to find out what it was. At this point, I was feeling woozy. My head was throbbing and I decided I needed a break. I entered into a room with windows so I could keep an eye on whatever the hell was going on out there. I was sitting staring out the window when I noticed even the trees looked different the closer I got towards the reactors. They were now bare and deformed. They looked like large bat wings curled in, but all the trees and branches were being blown away from the reactor towers. Almost like a continuous wind was pushing them away. I wonder how long I was out for. Could I have been passed out a whole day and all this happened? I tried to ease my mind. This felt like a living hell. Could I be dead? As all these horrible thoughts were racing through my mind, a mother holding a small child on her shoulder staggered past the window. "Hello?" I shouted, but to no response. She just kept on limping by in what looked like a great amount of pain. I ran outside in a desperate attempt to get her attention. "Please stop. I can help." I kept running towards her, yelling and waving my arms. When I finally got closer, she slowly stopped but stared straight forward. This stopped me dead in my tracks. As I was closer, I could make out the details on her. She was horribly burnt. Her ears were nothing but holes, and her face was a blank canvas of melted skin. The continuous wind blew the blanket covering her baby to reveal a large mass of flesh and small body parts half mutated into her body. Her child was dead. As I was now close enough for her to hear me, I could now hear her. A whimpering cry was coming from inside her skin-covered mouth. I was petrified in fear. A mutated monster stood in front of me, and I did not know what to do. In what felt like an eternity, she slowly turned her head towards me. She started motioning her head upwards in a sniffing action like she could smell me. That was enough for me to turn back towards the hospital and run as fast as I could without looking back. I could hear the muffled crying getting louder and louder as she chased me. It was almost like she wanted my help. I dashed inside and slammed the door behind me as hard as I could. Standing, staring at her, I felt a small win. That's when I heard it. Screams of agony started howling from everywhere. The mother immediately ran towards the woods in fear. I was anxiously waiting to see what made that creature run off when suddenly from behind, the building's horrific flesh-looking creature started running and limping in my direction. I knew I couldn't hide from these things if they could smell me, so I ran towards the roof. I closed as many doors as I could behind me, and quietly sat in an air vent as these creatures searched through the building. I tried to breathe as little as possible, but that was hard when you are terrified beyond belief. The building was so decrepit and old, I could peek through where I was hiding. I wanted to see what I was running and hiding from. The smaller ones had already left the building. Only the bigger ones were still there. As I was peeking through, a huge puffy man in a hazmat suit stumbled by. He was bloated. He looked like he could pop any second. His suit was sewn shut like human flesh, like it was a part of his body. He was terribly burnt or mutated. I couldn't tell. Their flesh looked like melted candle wax. They all finally left, and I was alone with my fear. I felt like prey here. I needed to escape whatever this was. I needed to get closer to my rental car and to a hospital. Now that it was quite enough, I left that building and slowly made my way towards the exit trail. As I was walking, I noticed it felt like time wasn't moving here. It had been the same time of day as when I woke up. I surely had been a few hours, but the sky was still the same red and orange. This gave me an uneasy feeling. While I was walking, I noticed a normal-looking house far off in the distance. It wasn't old and abandoned looking. It had a lit torch on the front porch like someone was currently living there. Finally, some good news, I thought. But this was towards the reactors, a place I did not want to go. I decided that house was my best bet, so I carefully made my way towards it, not wanting to alarm any more creatures on the way. As I was walking, I could still hear the odd screams and howls off in the distance. I could hear the pain these creatures were in. As I walked towards the house, I looked up at the tall reactor towers. They looked enormous. I lifted my hand to shade my eyes from the glow that seemed to emanate off them. That's when I realized I could see the bones through my skin. This caused me to quicken my pace. I started to jog since I was finally getting closer to the house. As I arrived, I could see a fire lit inside the house. Someone was definitely living there. "Hello? Anybody home? I need help, please," I let out desperately. At that moment, a deformed dog came running out from beneath the deck. I ran back and stumbled as the dog was halted by a chain, barely getting me. The dog missing all its fur and constantly scratching itself stared me down a few inches from my face, growling and snarling at me. Suddenly behind him the door flew open. "Who's there? Why are you here?" said a man as he walked forward. He was old and looked like a priest. He was wearing a torn robe and some kind of necklace around his neck. "Who's there?" he repeated, but louder this time. Me. I'm here," I responded, confused. "Can you not see me?" I asked. "No, I cannot see. Come in, quickly now," he said while motioning his arms towards the house. His dog seemed to calm. I walked past the beast and inside his house as he shut the door behind me. His place looked old. Everything in here looked like it was from a century ago. "Who are you? Why are you still here?" I asked. "Why are you here? You should not be here," he responded. "I'm lost, I think. I don't know how I ended up here exactly. I was exploring the city when somehow I ended up in this place." "You don't just end up here. What were you doing exactly?" he sternly asked. "Well, I was looking for someone. Someone was following me and I tried to see who it was. Then they touched me and I ended up here." I see. So you were why all those things were riled up then, huh? I heard a group of those things dragging something up to the church. I'm guessing it was you." "Me? What do you mean? I'm right here." "You are here, yes, but they took your body up to the church," he said as he walked towards a window, pointing outwards. "They sacrifice something every chance they get, the dirty bastards," he let out in anger. "I'm sick of those things. I wish they could go away so I could rest in peace." "What are you? Are you one of them?" I slowly asked. "No, I used to be a priest. I stayed back as long as I could to help the people pass on in peace, long after the army left everyone behind. But I guess I stayed too long because somehow I ended up stuck here. I can't leave or move on, so I learned to live with those monsters. I stay near the towers because it's the one place they seem to hate." "Is there any way I can leave this place?" I asked. I don't know. Maybe if you get your body before they tear it apart we can, but I have never tried such a thing. Most who come here never make it out." "People have been here before?" "A few, yeah. Lost souls like you. A few government scientists came here once but never returned. I think the monsters scared them away." "Those creatures, the monsters, what are they exactly? Were they always here?" "No, they were people like you. They were left behind or chose to stay behind. Some tried to help. Some wanted to take advantage of the situation with greed. In the end, the radiation was too much for us all. The government hid from us how bad the situation really was." "Am I dead?" I asked suddenly. "No, not yet. I am, but right now you are in between. You must hurry. I don't know how much time you have. We collect your body and try to put you back." He grabbed a walking stick, put a few vials of some liquid into his pocket, and we were off to the church. As we were leaving, he untied his dog and I asked him what that thing was. "Man's best friend," he responded. "I used to leave him beds outside my house. He seemed scared of those things out there. Eventually, we gained each other's trust and have been following each other ever since. Not all the things here are like him, though. Almost all those things out there will try to rip you to shreds given the chance. They take the limbs off anything and leave them at the altar. Like a gift." "A gift for who?" I asked. "There's one out here who stays hidden, but all those creatures fear him. So they leave him gifts hoping he won't go after them. What is he? I don't know, but he was close to the reactors when everything went down. I think he is the most mutated of us all. As we were walking along a path, I noticed a body mutated into the ground. Its limbs were cut off and it was slowly flailing its arms about, like he was trying to get unstuck. But he was cemented into the ground. The old man walked past it without a notice. I wanted to try to help, but I'm sure it would have attacked me the second it was loose. As we got closer to the church, I noticed bones were scattered everywhere. Be careful, he warned. How can you see the way? I asked. I have been here a very long time, so long that I barely remember my life before the disaster. My memories slip away more and more every day, and I fear that soon I will become one of those creatures. I felt petty for this man. I wish I could help him. We walked towards the back entrance of the church. The windows were all broken and the front doors were barricaded shut. We slowly entered. As we rounded the corner, I could see my lifeless body laying on the ground. It felt odd looking at my own body. I ran towards myself. I was cold to the touch. I'm dead, I let out in worry. No, you are not, and be quiet. We're in its den, said the old man. Now lay down inside your body, he instructed. I followed along and laid beside myself. No, lay in your body, he angrily responded as he was gathering candles and some cloths. I moved a bit over and somehow I was able to lay in myself. It was an odd sensation. I was cold and I could feel a wetness all around me. Now what do I do? Nothing. You wait. He placed lit candles around me, started soaking some pieces of clothes with a liquid and placed it on my body. Stay quiet, and whatever you do, don't move. He took a few steps back and began to speak in a language I did not recognize. As he was doing this, I noticed the statue behind him began to move. It was the one he was speaking about. The one who they feed. I yelled to warn him when the beast attacked from behind, launching both of them to the ground. His dog immediately jumped to his aid when the creature threw him into the wall, leaving him lying motionless. He was terrifying looking. He had long, skinny arms with legs that were backwards at the knee. Blood was leaking from its fanged mouth while its bloody fingertips wrapped around the arms of the priest. Don't move, he shouted. I was frozen in fear being near this creature, but I wished to help. While the priest was holding back the fangs from digging into him, he pulled out a vial and threw it into the monster's huge mouth. It released its grip from him and staggered backwards, coughing a green glowing substance that released smoke from anything it touched. I thought for sure it was radioactive. The monster retreated outwards while the priest stood up examining his wounds. The son of a bitch dug deep into me. He said, "Are you okay?" I asked. I should be able to finish this, but just in case they come back, I'm going to make sure I get the last hit. He stood up and walked over to his dog. Don't worry, buddy. I'll be seeing you on the other side, he said while petting his hand. He then walked around the church, pouring something onto the ground, saving the most for the entrance we used. What's that? I asked. You'll see, he responded. He then walked back over to me and started chanting again. Are you going to be okay? I asked. He ignored me and kept speaking in that unknown language. Not a minute into his ritual, a screaming roar came from outside the building. He started chanting louder while pushing something out of his pocket. I could see through the holes and broken windows that a mob of creatures were coming directly our way. There's a lot of them, I shouted. He then lit a match and threw it into the substance on the ground. A purple flame erupted and lit our entire surroundings on fire. Arms and heads then started reaching into the building trying to grab at us. I felt helpless. I could feel the certain death on the other side of the walls. He took a step closer towards me as the fire grew and climbed up the walls. A strange glow began to form around myself. I pulled my hand up to look closely at my fingertips, illuminating when I realized my physical body moved with me now. "It's working," I shouted. At that moment, more and more creatures began ripping open the building. The glow around my body grew brighter and brighter when the roof started falling down, nearly hitting us. He then knelt down while continuing his chant. I started feeling sick. My body suddenly felt extremely cold. As the light around me grew too bright to look at, the monsters broke through the walls, storming inside at a great pace. The priest ignored all of this and kept on his chant. The roof then collapsed. As it was falling closer and closer, and the creatures were within arm's length of both of us, I blacked out. I was surrounded by darkness. I awoke in a dark room. The sun was down and I was freezing. I sat up and realized I was back in that room with the mirror, my camera sitting on the ledge and my backpack laying next to me. Was that a dream? I asked. I stood up and looked at the time. It was 3:15 a.m. in the morning. What just happened? I asked myself. I gathered my stuff and walked outside. It was dead quiet. No sound except the wind rustling and leaves on the trees. I started my way back and everything looked normal. I was back in the world of the living. I noticed a collapsed church on my walk back and stopped by to look at it. It looked burnt. Graffiti covered one remaining wall. I stood there wondering if I had imagined everything that had happened, and as I was looking through the debris, I noticed old priest robes, completely shredded to pieces. I turned around and walked as fast as I could towards my rental car, not wanting to think of everything that had just happened. The car started fine. I made it home with a few bruises, but nothing bad. I looked over my footage the following week, and to my disappointment, it did not capture anything. Just me collapsing to the floor with nothing standing behind me. Did that really happen? Or did I just hit my head hard enough to think that happened? I have no idea. I still have nightmares of those creatures and that place. I moved through the room, impressed by the colors and realistic textures of the heavy velour curtains and the hardwood floor below me. The air was golden with dappled light, visible dust floating down to the wooden boards. My feet were visible when I turned my eyes down to them, and I heard Joe mutter a quick, "Gotta fix the shoes," as he watched along with me. The vanity table stood ahead of me. On it were 3 stands, each with a blank mask on them. The first was a Mardi Gras-style porcelain one, unadorned white. The next was a latex Halloween style in the shape of a witch's face. The third was like an alien, but less cartoon and more visceral. I stood in front of that one. "All right, paints are in the drawer." Joe's voice split into my reality. I made a move and slid the drawer open. Jokingly, I pulled it out so that the contents spilled all over the ground. "You should add a clatter sound." I reviewed the mess. Several paintbrushes and a paint kit, all still intact. I bent down and my movements were reflected in my vision. I collected the items and placed them on the table between the alien and witch masks. I gripped a large brush and opened the paint box. There were 10 shades inside, and I dipped the bristles in each. A little of every color. I began to drag the murky rainbow across the alien mask. "Gross," came Joe's retort, somewhere behind me. "I've got to test it all," I told him. "Someone's bound to try this at some point." I made some stripes across the alien's face. My brush cleared itself after each movement, and I would dip it in a new color. I painted the eyes black with a white star in the center of each. Lips red, puckered. "Looking good," I laughed. "Now put it on," Joe said as I completed my art. I let the paint box drop to the ground and reached out for the mask. Yeah, that just falls to the floor quietly. Not realistic. And the way it landed, it floated down like a feather. "Come on, Joe, you can do better." Using both hands, I took it off the stand and shifted it into my head. "Is it on?" "Well, it would have fallen to the floor if you dropped it, so it must be," Joe replied. "So what now? Can I look at myself?" "The mirrors are not done. Why don't you come out? That's all I've got so far." I moved the virtual headset and set down my 2 controllers. Back in Joe's studio, walls painted into a green screen, I sank down into the couch and watched as he worked on the code. "Thoughts?" he asked, typing furiously, not even bothering to look up. "It's good. It made me want to try putting every mask on, just stacking them on top of each other." He scoffed and I kept going. Let's see. Graphics are really good. Better than any VR you've done before. Needs some tweaks, obviously. The mirror is necessary. I want to see my handiwork." "Alright." I wrote in shoes. "What kind?" "Just white tennis shoes." "I would never." "Well, in here you would. If you stick around, I think I can get a loose coat up for the mirror in an hour or 2. We can give it a try before calling it a night." "Fine." The place was empty. Shades of midnight blue filtered through windows in the hall. I paced up and down the corridor. Sent a message to my girlfriend. Told her I'd be home late. I stepped outside for air while Joe continued typing code. I've tested every single module he's come up with. Some of them so boring that I longed for a virtual escape from those worlds. Once he made a simulation of taking out the garbage. You'd bring the can to the curb and a garbage truck would come get it. He has me test his programs because I pushed them to the limits. I found a loophole in his garbage module. You could throw the can at the garbage truck and it would blink out of the picture and not come back. Later, I discovered I could take the lid off the can and jump inside. I begged him to write the code so that you could get taken away by the trash collectors and end up in an infinite dump. I pestered him about it so long that he eventually budged. We reached a compromise. You could get thrown into the truck, but then the module ends. An hour turned into 2, 3. I drank another coffee. The entire building was deserted. Joe was hunched over the computer, making more adjustments. "Just let me try it," I said. "I need to go." "It's really not ready." "Well, let me do it anyway. I'll come back tomorrow and test it again if you want." "I don't know." I was already equipping the headset. I could hear Joe swearing and saying, "It's not done." But I gripped the controllers and selected the module from the rough menu. Shocked, I looked around the virtual room. The graphics were sharper, clear-cut dimensions and realistic interplay with the light. The motes of dust shimmered in a way that made me want to cough. I took a step forward and moved a controller-clad hand through the cloud and it dissipated the way real dust might. "Joe, this is really good." I rarely gave him such compliments. I didn't hear a response, but I figured he was shocked by my candor. The room had an ambient noise now. I could hear the dim buzz of the vanity mirror lights, and the light creaking off the floorboards as I tread over them in my white tennis shoes. The masks were waiting. This time I made my way to the porcelain one on the far left. The graphics, I said, are so real. I heard a slight echo somewhere behind me, like my voice was reaching up into the wooden rafters of the backstage area this module was set in. I opened the drawer and it made a groaning sound as wood grinded against wood. Inside was the paint box, replaced and good as new. The colors were so vivid. I dipped a small brush into the magenta paint and flicked the brush against the lips of the porcelain mask, curling up the soft pink light. It took the color in stages, gradually getting deeper with each sweep of my brush. I added blue washes over the cheeks and purple around the eyes. I painted a sort of cloud on the forehead, green and gold. The whole thing was a testament to my lack of artistry. It seemed to carry over into the module. There was a stack of ribbons in the drawer and I selected yellow ones, which I was able to tie through the sides of the mask. As I did this, I knocked the paint box to the floor. A loud clatter came. I turned my real-life head down and viewed the virtual floor. The paint had come out of its container and was spilled everywhere. Joe, wow, this is incredible. I praised him, letting my normal ribbon go for once. He had knocked this one out of the park. He still didn't answer. I reached forward and grabbed the mask. I almost dropped it when I realized I could feel the controllers in my hand. But instead, I felt the cool surface of the sticky porcelain. There was no way to mimic such a thing in the game. It was that good that it was tricking my mind into taking over my senses. The mask easily slipped over my face. Suddenly my view came through two eyes. I could hear my muffled breathing as it met against the tiny air hole in the hard mask. Why could I feel the weight of the mask? The red velvet curtain was slightly parted. Do I just go over here? Joe? No reply. Joe? I moved forward to the curtain and pulled it aside. The mirror was there, and it revealed my reflection with a perfect rendering of the mask I had painted on my face. I stood there and admired myself, swiveling to see the sides. Joe, I'm going to play around in here. I've got to test the parameters. That's what I'm here for, right? I laughed anxiously. I reached behind me to where he normally sat, but my hands raked the theater wall. Well? I spoke aloud because I was nervous, but I would never let him know that. Someone will probably try to take the mask off and look at their virtual face, so let's give that a go. I tried to remove it, but apparently he had coded away that possibility. I moved toward the witch mask and took it off the rack. I tried to slip it over the porcelain one, but it caught on it, as though the head hole were too small. I let it fall to the ground. As I walked back in the other direction, I tipped over the witch's long, matted hair. Alright, this is getting a little weird. Obviously something's on the rug in your office that I tripped over. Why did it feel like the witch's hair? I'm coming out of here. I made a move to take off the headset, but just found my hands clutching the porcelain of the mask. Joe? Joe? My voice was deepening with panic. I backed to where the couch is in Joe's office, but I smacked into the vanity table. I felt around and could only feel paintbrushes, mask stands, the burning hot bulbs. Get me out of here, Joe, I called. Had I really gotten this turned around? I felt around all the walls, but nothing was familiar. No beat-up couch, no mini fridge, no desk, not even Joe himself, cackling at me from the corner. He was just gone. All his stuff gone. You got me, I said. Alright, you really got me now. Good one, bud. I'm sorry for all the grief I've caused you. You're a hell of a coder. Now what? Can you get me out of here? Door opened on the opposite side of the theater. The light it cast was bright, like it was daytime beyond. Something was peering in. How'd you get stuck in here? I squinted. A man was looking in at me. He glanced at the table of masks and the mess of paint on the floor. What did you do to our props? Get that off your face. He took a few steps forward. I bolted out the door, running down the hall. I didn't know where I was going. Most of Joe's modules were only a single room, maybe a small lot like in the case of the garbage truck. This seemed to be a whole building. I snaked through another series of doors. I could hear that man yelling for me, his voice growling more and more distant. Eventually I came to an exit. It was daytime. Blinding light streamed through the glass doors. I caught a reflection of myself in the panel, and I was still wearing the porcelain mask. I grabbed my face and tugged until it came off. I shattered it onto the ground. Jagged pieces covered in my poor paint job. I again attempted to remove the headset, to drop the controllers, to hit the escape button on the left controller, but they weren't there. I couldn't feel them at all. I stepped through the doors and found myself out on the street. It was warm and sunny, far from the winter night I had wrestled with earlier, scraping snow and ice off of my car to make the trek to Joe's studio. People walked by, paying me no attention. My brain cataloged all the stimuli. I felt the sun on my skin, the ground beneath the tennis shoes. I reached out and let my hand brush over a rose bush. Pain seared through my fingertip. A drip of blood appeared on my middle finger. My skin was pale, not the right color. I looked back at the glass door I had just come through. The broken pieces of mask were still on the other side. I saw my reflection and gasped. My body was realistic, but not mine. My face, however, was a dark, unfinished blob. A head-shaped spot that seemed to blink in and out. Pixels dancing. No one seemed bothered by my appearance. I approached a group of people on the street and they blinked curiously at me. No one ran off in horror. "Excuse me, could you please tell me what color my eyes are?" As though I were trying to continue testing the parameters of the module. "Blue," said one. As another spoke in unison, "Brown." "What? They're not brown," said the first. The crowd descended into a puzzled argument as I backed away into the street. I continued up the hill and eventually asked someone for directions to 23rd Street, where Joe's studio is. I was given a series of instructions. I walked there, pausing to reflect on the unflinching reality of the entire scene. It appeared no different from any ordinary day in town. When I got to the studio, it was boarded up. Abandoned building with a condemned sign on the front door. The ice cream parlor that sits beside it was still there. Swirls of chocolate and vanilla were carried out on waffle cones. Excited children extending hands to grab them. There was a woman sitting outside the coffee shop across the street. I approached her cautiously and asked if I could borrow her phone. She agreed and passed it over. I texted my girlfriend and asked if I could sit there for a minute until she replied, "Sure." "Let me ask you something," I said. "What do I look like?" "Like a perfectly normal man," she responded, after a moment's consideration. "That's a strange thing to say." She thought it over. "How? Oh, here. You have a reply." She handed the phone to me. The reply was as follows. Randomly generated response. I sent a text to Joe hoping I remembered his number. An automated reply came saying the number was not in service. The woman asked for her phone back. First, I took a selfie and then opened up her photos application. The entire thing was filled with pictures of a single tree. 230 photos of one tree. The last photo was a mess of pixels. Nothing but indistinct squares of color. "Thanks," I said and began to walk away. "It's a nice photo of you." She smiled earnestly. "Want me to forward it?" She called as I moved away. I made my way back to the theater. When I slipped into the backstage area, I found it full of actors preparing for a stage production. They were huddled around the mirror, doing their makeup. I didn't see the masks or paint box anywhere. "Excuse me? I asked, sliding up to the thespians. Has anyone seen a witch mask? Or a box of paints that were on the floor? It goes out with the garbage, one of them said. They come every Tuesday, the tall man told me, nodding as though he was being very helpful. I walked aimlessly back through the halls until I came across a small office with an open door. I sat at the desk and looked up Joe on social media. He was there, but covered in pixels. Whoever's account I was logged into had a seemingly normal page, but with a series of blank status updates and some that were nothing but semicolons. I logged onto Reddit and wrote this up. Now I'll message the link to Joe. Everyone in the building is getting ready for this play. I can hear the audience filtering in. Their voices are loud but ambient. Joe is trying to teach me a lesson. Must be. There's a mirror above the desk. Every time I stand up to look at myself, it turns into a dizzy spiral of ones and zeros and I drop back into the chair. My hand is hovering over the post button, but I'm watching all the news stories come in and they're all wrong. They trail off into nonsense. Some of them are pages and pages of commas and blank space. Comments say things like, beautiful penmanship, and I hope I can be like you when I'm younger. It's pointless, isn't it? To put this up on this version of the internet? I'll hit the post button and hope my words don't break up into a million pixels and alt signs. I have to test the parameters. That's what Joe pays me to do. To enter his worlds and see if I can break them. Here we go. Bury these for me, the woman said, thrusting a well-manicured fistful of pearls in front of the gardener's face. And whatever you do, don't let my husband see them. Then she threw them on the dirt beside her and walked away, bouncing on her toes to keep her long red heels from sinking into the earth. It wasn't the first, and wouldn't be the last time she was asked to hide precious jewels amongst the rose bushes. They were presents from the many men she would waltz in and out of the house while the husband was away on business trips. The gardener pitied the husband as she dug holes for the diamond earrings and sapphire brooches, until he approached her with an armful of papers and the decency to look ashamed. Bury these for me, and whatever you do, don't let my wife see them. They were ticket stubs, bills for vacation homes in Aruba, records of child support payments, and many, many pictures. At least, the gardener thought as she tore the heads off of smiling women and added them to the mulch around the petunias. They're a good match. They deserve each other. She kept telling herself that when the woman brought her sterling bracelets with a black eye and the husband brought her half-finished divorce papers with deep scratches on his cheek and forearms. She stopped when she saw the decorations for the baby shower go up in the yard. In her small shed at the edge of the property, she lay awake most nights, listening and worrying. She could hear the husband screaming as the baby screamed and, later, the woman crying as the baby cried. She had never much cared what the couple did to each other, but for those past few years, she couldn't help picturing what was happening to the child behind closed doors. Her fears eased when he grew old enough to toddle out of the house to meet her. The first time she met him, she was trimming the hedges into uniform peaks. He stared up at her with bright, inquisitive eyes and told her his name was Jeremy. She responded in turn that hers was Maria, and he nodded, satisfied, and ran back to where his mother lay tanning. There wasn't a scratch on him, and Maria slept well that night for the first time in 4 years. From then on, he would visit her from time to time as she weeded and watered and pruned and plucked. He asked her questions, and she would try her best to answer them. Sometimes, if she was very lucky, she would even make him laugh. As he grew older, the visits became more frequent, until they were an almost daily affair. One particularly hot day, as he was stretched out with his arms behind him on the grass, and she was planting rhododendrons, he said to her, "You know, Maria, you're a lot nicer than my mom. I wish you were my mom instead." Maria hadn't trusted herself to look up, as her heart was swelling and she felt any movement would cause her to combust. She promised herself in that moment that she would do anything to protect Jeremy and keep him happy. As the years went on, she couldn't help feeling that Isaiah probably would have looked a lot like Jeremy did, if he had been given the chance. She was still buying jewelry for the woman and documents of her husband. He was filing for bankruptcy. If only he knew the riches hidden behind his feet. So it was only a matter of time before she started buying things for their son, too. It started with the small birds that twittered outside his window early in the morning, and then the squirrels that had infested his treehouse. She put them to rest around the magnolia in the backyard. There was the hamster that had been a fascination until it chewed through his television cables, and the puppy that had been a favorite until it made the mistake of biting him. She had felt guilty at first when she covered their little faces with dirt, but then she thought of Jeremy's happy, smiling, and bright. And she remembered that she would do anything and everything for him. The gardener kept her promise on that night, when she awoke in her little shed to shouting in the big house. She thought of Jeremy and ran outside, across the lawn, through the front doors and into the fray. Shots were fired and Jeremy turned to look at her, tears collecting instantly in his eyes. The gun was dropped and she kicked it away from him, taking the boy into her arms and turning him away from where his parents lay as he started to cry. The woman had found out about the bankruptcy and had been screaming bloody murder and tearing the room apart. It was enough to make anyone make a rash decision. She led him upstairs and tucked him into bed, promising him that she would have it all taken care of when he woke up in the morning. She kissed his forehead, went back downstairs, and dragged their bodies out the front door to the flower beds. She was digging when she heard the sirens, and the driveway was suddenly flooded with flashing red and blue lights. The police surrounded her with flashlights and guns and were shouting things at her, but she wasn't listening. She was watching as Jeremy stepped out onto the front porch with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and was greeted by 2 officers. His face was red and splotchy, and he looked like he was trying to speak but couldn't. Instead, he pointed an accusatory finger at her while staring at the ground. It broke her heart. She turned her attention to the officers in front of her and swallowed hard. "You don't understand," the gardener said, raising hands that were grimy from dirt and gunpowder as she remembered all the little faces. "I buried them all for him.